Hey, welcome back. If you're here, you probably already know the drill. You've got somewhere comfortable to be. Maybe you're already lying down. Maybe the lights are off. Maybe the world outside has gone quiet enough that you can finally let your brain settle into something that isn't a task or a worry or a thing you forgot to do. This is the space for facts you love about a show you love, delivered slowly, with no rush, no urgency, nowhere to be. Just you and 2 hours of the deepest rabbit hole in animated television. Tonight, we're going all the way into Rick and Morty. Not just the episodes you've watched 100 times, though we'll visit those, but the stories that live behind the screen. The decisions that almost didn't get made. The science that's more real than you'd expect. The character details so carefully buried that even longtime fans sometimes miss them. The history of how two people sitting on the floor of an empty office in Los Angeles changed animated television forever with a show they wrote in 6 hours. So go ahead and let your eyes get heavy. Let your breathing slow down. We're going on a long, unhurried journey through the universe of Rick and Morty, and there's no need to rush any of it. Part 1. The ground before the show, where Rick and Morty actually came from. Let's start at the very beginning, which in this case is not a pilot episode or a network meeting. It's a film festival. A specific film festival held monthly at a venue in Los Angeles called Channel 101, which was co-founded in the early 2000s by a writer named Dan Harmon and his collaborator Rob Schrab. But the idea behind Channel 101 was beautifully simple. Anyone could submit a short film in the format of a pilot episode. A live audience would watch all the submissions and then vote on which ones got to continue as a series. If your pilot got voted off, it was done. You could come back and try again with something new, but that particular show was finished. The audience was the only judge. The format was designed for scrappy, independent creators, people who had ideas but no platform, people who were willing to make something fast and weird and put it in front of a live crowd for an immediate verdict. It attracted a specific kind of creative energy, the kind that thrives on speed and absurdity and the particular freedom that comes from knowing your audience is right there in the room. Justin Roiland, who was in his mid-20s at the time and working as a producer on reality programming, started submitting content to Channel 101 in 2004, about a year after the festival launched. His submissions were not safe. They were, by his own description, sick and twisted, full of shock value and deliberately strange humor that got confused reactions from the audience. They weren't designed to win. They were designed to be themselves, which in retrospect tells you everything about what Roiland's creative instincts were always like. He wasn't calculating what would land. He was making what amused him and trusting that some people would feel the same. Dan Harmon, who had already co-created the comedy show Heat Vision, and Jack years earlier, and was working his way toward what would eventually become the NBC sitcom Community, noticed something in Roiland's submissions. He was drawn to this guy who would create deliberately strange, off-putting cartoons and present them to an audience that might boo him. There was an honesty to it. The two started collaborating, and over the years they developed a creative shorthand, a shared sense of humor about what was funny and why. In 2006, Roiland was fired from a television job he described as creatively stifling. Rather than slow down, he put that energy into a new project for Channel 101, a short animated film that would turn out to be the direct ancestor of Rick and Morty. He called it The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty. The title should tell you something immediately. Doc and Marty are unmistakably Doc Brown and Marty McFly from Back to the Future, and the beloved 1985 film about a teenage boy who accidentally travels back in time with a mad scientist in a DeLorean. Roiland's short was a crude, deliberately offensive parody, featuring the two characters in exaggerated, chaotic situations that had nothing to do with time travel and everything to do with pushing the limits of what an animated short could get away with. The audience at Channel 101 reacted strongly. They didn't necessarily know what to make of it, but they felt something. Roiland kept making more shorts with these characters, and slowly, not immediately but slowly, something started to develop that was richer than pure shock value. There was a genuine relationship forming between the older, brilliant, unstable character and the younger, nervous, impressionable one. The dynamic had chemistry that went beyond parody, and it had the shape of something that could actually go somewhere. For a while, Doc and Marty existed in a kind of quantum state, well-liked within the Channel 101 community but not developed into anything larger. They stayed in this limbo for years. Roiland kept working in the industry. He'd do voice work for Disney's Fish Hooks, he'd show up in bit parts, he'd keep making things at Channel 101, but nothing clicked into a full series. Then, in 2012, something shifted. Harmon had been working on Community at NBC, the beloved meta-comedy about a study group at a community college that kept pulling off increasingly elaborate and self-aware storylines. It was critically adored, fiercely defended by its fans, and eternally at risk of cancellation. In 2012, Harmon was briefly fired from Community by the network. It was a painful, public creative separation that became its own television industry story. Adult Swim, which operates as the nighttime programming block of Cartoon Network, was actively looking for a more primetime, broadly appealing animated show, something that could compete differently. They approached Harmon. He was initially skeptical. He didn't see himself as an animation person, and he wasn't sure Adult Swim was the right home for whatever he would make. But he called Roiland. And Roiland, who had just come off 3 failed animated pilots at Fox and was feeling creatively frustrated, had an immediate answer. Let's use the Doc and Marty characters. Let's rename them, expand them, build a world around them. Harmon liked it. They put together a pitch, Adult Swim greenlit a pilot, and the real work began. On the writing of that first draft is one of the more remarkable behind-the-scenes stories in modern television. It happened in a single evening on the Paramount Pictures lot in Dan Harmon's office from Community. At this point, the office was largely unfurnished. Harmon's tenure there had been turbulent, and the space felt accordingly bare. The two of them sat on the floor with their laptops, cross-legged, and Harmon was about to call it a night and go home when Roiland stopped him. Roiland told him that if they didn't write the whole thing right now, tonight, it would end up taking 3 months. Harmon later recalled that Roiland seemed to have a premonition about this, some instinct that the window was open and they needed to go through it immediately. They stayed. They wrote the entire first draft in 6 hours. 6 hours. For a pilot episode of a show that would eventually be described by many critics as the most ambitious animated series of its generation, the seed was planted in a single, slightly frantic evening with 2 tired guys on the floor of an empty office. When they were done, they had the basic bones of what would become Rick and Morty. The older scientist, now named Rick Sanchez, was still a version of Doc Brown, brilliant, unstable, dismissive of consequences. The younger companion, Morty Smith, was still a version of Marty, nervous, overwhelmed, pulled along by someone else's chaos. But they were no longer a parody. They were their own characters now, with their own history, their own family around them, their own emotional weight. Adult Swim's development executive, Nick Weidenfeld, suggested the addition that made the whole thing click. Make the scientist the grandfather. Not just an older friend or mentor, but family. That one suggestion transformed the show's emotional landscape entirely. Now the adventures weren't just between a mad scientist and a kid he'd dragged along. They were between a grandfather and his grandson, with all the complicated love and obligation and disappointment and hope that carries. The family dynamic that Harmon had always been drawn to, messy, real, unresolved, was now the center of everything. The show officially premiered on Adult Swim on December 2, 2013. Its first season consisted of 11 episodes, airing on Monday nights at 10:30 in the evening. 2 months before the season even finished, in February 2014, Adult Swim renewed it for a second season, a sign of how clearly the network saw what it had on its hands. Rick and Morty had outperformed its competition in its time slot almost immediately. The audience found it quickly, held onto it, and came back hungry for more. Part 2. What came before? The shorts, the failed pilots, and the DNA of the show. It's worth spending some time with the history that fed into Rick and Morty, because the show didn't arrive fully formed from nothing. It was assembled piece by piece from ideas and concepts and creative failures that Roiland and Harmon had been accumulating for years. The most direct ancestor, of course, is that Doc and Marty short from 2006. Roiland created roughly 15 minutes of total content with those 2 characters across multiple shorts, but none of them ever became a proper ongoing series. They existed in this interesting half-life, popular within their small community, beloved by the people who found them, but fundamentally unresolved. There was always more story to tell with those characters. but the shorts themselves never built a proper world. They were snapshots of a relationship, not a sustained narrative. Then there's the influence of a rejected pilot that Roiland had developed for Cartoon Network called Dog World. The concept was delightfully simple and very Roiland. An alternate universe Earth where dogs had evolved as the dominant species and kept humans as pets. Roiland wanted something that felt epic and scientifically grounded and funny all at once. He brought in a composer named Ryan Elder, who would later become one of the most important creative collaborators on Rick and Morty, to write a theme for the Dog World pitch. Elder describes being given references including the Farscape theme, Invader Zim, and Doctor Who, and being told to put them all in a blender and see what came out. What came out was a piece of music that felt genuinely adventurous, something with movement and mystery and a particular kind of synthesizer warmth that suggested vast spaces and small characters navigating them. Elder barely changed it from the Dog World version to what eventually became the Rick and Morty theme. The song that millions of people around the world now associate with interdimensional portals and nihilistic grandparents was originally written for a show about dogs who keep humans as pets. Dog World never got made, but the music survived and found its home. The second episode of Rick and Morty's first season, an episode called Lawnmower Dog about a dog who gains superintelligence and builds a civilization, contains an inside joke directly referencing Dog World. At the end of the episode, Rick makes a throwaway comment wishing he could see an 11-minute, board-driven weekly cartoon about intelligent dogs. It's Roiland winking at his own failed pitch, turning it into a joke at his own expense. There's something worth noting about the general posture of failure that preceded Rick and Morty. Roiland had created 3 failed animated pilots for Fox before the show got made. He'd had the Doc and Marty shorts without a home for years. He'd had Dog World rejected by Cartoon Network. Harmon had been publicly fired from the show he'd spent years building. Both of them arrived at the creation of Rick and Morty with a real and specific understanding of what it felt like to have your creative work rejected, shelved, or ignored. This is, arguably, part of what makes the show feel the way it does. There is a particular emotional honesty in work that comes from people who've experienced failure and are not afraid of it. Rick and Morty doesn't treat failure or disappointment as aberrations to be avoided. It treats them as constants, as the texture of existence. Characters in the show are allowed to be broken, to fail without redemption, to face consequences that don't resolve. That philosophical honesty, that particular refusal to pretend things are better than they are, has the fingerprints of the creative struggles that preceded it all over it. There's also the influence of Harmon's formative creative work, which was broad but consistent. He had been shaped by The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Douglas Adams' masterwork of cosmic comedy that treated the universe as fundamentally absurd, but still worthy of attention. He had been shaped by Doctor Who, which more than almost any other show understood how to make a single character's relationship with time and space feel personal and emotional rather than abstract. He'd been shaped by Saturday Night Live's particular brand of sketch comedy, which taught you that even the most absurd premise could become moving if you committed to the characters within it. Roiland, for his part, had grown up on The Simpsons, The Ren and Stimpy Show, Beavis and Butthead, and Invader Zim. You can see all of these in Rick and Morty's DNA if you know where to look. The Simpsons gave it the family structure, a dysfunctional household where impossible things happen, but emotional bonds persist anyway. Ren and Stimpy gave it the permission for grotesque imagery, the willingness to show things as ugly or disturbing without flinching. And Invader Zim, the short-lived Nickelodeon series about an alien invader whose incompetence constantly undermines his own plans, gave it a model for how to do dark comedy in an animated format without softening the darkness. The character design itself carries genetic traces of Roiland's animation roots. The small W-shaped mouth that Rick and Morty characters sometimes make is a direct reference to a similar expression that Ren from the Ren and Stimpy show frequently used. Roiland acknowledged this explicitly, noting that both he and his contemporaries, creators like Pendleton Ward of Adventure Time and J.G. Quintel of Regular Show, were all roughly the same generation, all shaped by the same touchstones, all unconsciously tapping into similar visual vocabularies. Adult Swim, at the time Rick and Morty launched, was home to shows like Aqua Teen Hunger Force, The Venture Brothers, and Robot Chicken. a programming block that had built its reputation on animation, that was deliberately strange, that wasn't trying to appeal to children, that understood its audience was staying up late by choice and wanted something that met them at that hour with the appropriate energy. Rick and Morty fit into this context, but also pushed beyond it because it had ambitions that went further than comedy. It wanted to make you feel things, not just laugh, but feel. Part 3, Drawing the Universe. Art style, animation, and the visual language of the show. There's something interesting about how Rick and Morty looks, something that rewards slow attention. On the surface, it seems like simple, almost crude animation, the kind of thing you might describe as deliberately unpolished. But the longer you spend with it, the more you notice the specific choices embedded in every frame. Roiland has always been transparent about the stylistic influences on the show's visual language. The characters are drawn with deliberate oddness, with the show's art director for Season 3, Jeffrey Thompson, explaining that characters were intentionally given asymmetrical features to prevent them from looking too normal to exist within the Rick and Morty universe. There's something conceptually interesting about that decision. The visual world is slightly wrong on purpose, slightly off-center, because a world that contains Rick Sanchez should feel like a world where the rules bend a little. The production of Rick and Morty's animation was handled primarily by Bardell Entertainment in Vancouver, Canada for the first 8 seasons, with Mercury Filmworks in Ottawa and Lighthouse Studios in Ireland joining the production for later seasons. This is relevant because animation at this scale is collaborative in ways that aren't always visible to viewers. There are hundreds of people involved in bringing any given episode to life, translating storyboards into motion, giving characters the physical weight and expressiveness that makes their emotional moments land. One of the things that distinguishes the show visually is how seriously it takes its science fiction settings. The alien worlds and interdimensional spaces that Rick and Morty travel through are not interchangeable backgrounds. They're specific. Each has its own visual logic, its own palette, its own sense of what kind of life might have evolved there and what that life's architecture might look like. The team working on the show understood that selling the reality of a given alien world, even in a comedy, requires enough internal consistency to make the viewer's brain accept it. The portal gun, which functions as the show's primary device for getting from one reality to another, is visually one of the most distinctive props in animated television. Its green swirling portals have become an iconic image associated with the show. The choice of green was deliberate. It's an alien, slightly unsettling color for a doorway, unlike the blues and whites that science fiction often reaches for when depicting energy and technology. Green has a slightly biological quality, something organic and alive about it, which makes sense for a device that tears holes in the fabric of space-time. You're not stepping through a clean technological aperture. You're stepping through something that feels like it was grown. The show's character animation also has a particular relationship with imperfection that goes beyond visual design. Roiland, as the original voice of both Rick and Morty, recorded his performances with a high degree of improvisation. He would do the scripted version of a scene and then try multiple alternate takes, what he called alts, exploring different emotional registers, different comedic timings, different line readings that hadn't been written but felt natural in the moment. This improvisational quality in the vocal performance was then translated into the animation, which had to capture not just the words but the particular energy of how those words were delivered. The result is a show that, despite being animated, doesn't feel scripted in the way that animated shows often do. There's a looseness to how Rick and Morty talk to each other, a quality of voices overlapping and interrupting and reacting to each other in real time, even though the animation was produced after the recording. The directors working on the show, people like Brian Newton, Jacob Hare, Anthony Chun, and Erica Hayes, had to translate this improvisational vocal energy into visual storytelling, which required a particular kind of creative attentiveness. One remarkable note about the show's directors: Erica Hayes was promoted from storyboard artist to director during the show's production, and Adult Swim noted that she had been working as a coffee barista just 6 years before that promotion. The show has a history of creating space for people to grow into roles rather than only hiring established veterans, which has contributed to a certain freshness in how individual episodes are approached. The music, which we touched on briefly with the theme song's origin story, is also a crucial part of the show's visual language. But composer Ryan Elder scores the show with the directive to take the science fiction absolutely seriously. to play the music as though the show means it, even when the scene is comedic. This creates a specific kind of cognitive dissonance that is central to how Rick and Morty works emotionally. When something terrible is happening to Rick and Morty and the music swells with genuine grandeur, you feel the weight of it. You're allowed to laugh, but the sadness underneath the laugh is real, because the music refuses to let you off the hook. Elder described his approach as wanting the score to push against the comedy, to hold space for the genuine tragedy running under the surface of almost every episode. Part 4. The real science underneath the story. Quantum mechanics, the multiverse, and the ideas the show is actually built on. One of the things that separates Rick and Morty from most animated comedies is its genuine relationship with scientific ideas. The show is not scientifically accurate in any rigorous sense. Its writers are comedians and storytellers, not physicists, but it engages with real scientific concepts in a way that is unusually serious for the genre. The central conceit of the show, the one that makes all the interdimensional adventures possible, draws directly from one of the most fascinating and genuinely contested ideas in modern physics: the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. This interpretation was proposed in 1957 by a physicist named Hugh Everett, who was then a graduate student at Princeton. Everett's core idea was that quantum mechanics, taken at face value, but predicts not just probabilities, but actual physical events. When a quantum particle can be in two states, say a coin that could land heads or tails, the many worlds interpretation says that both outcomes actually happen in two branches of reality that diverge and never interact again. The implications of this, if taken seriously, are staggering. Every quantum event that could go multiple ways creates branching realities. And since quantum events are happening constantly, at the subatomic level of everything that exists, the number of branching realities is not just large, but inconceivably vast. There would be a version of reality for every possible outcome of every possible quantum event since the universe began. There would be versions of you who made different choices, who went different ways, who survived things the you in this reality didn't survive, and who didn't survive things you did. Rick and Morty takes this seriously enough to build an entire cosmology around it. The show's multiverse is not just a narrative device for getting characters into interesting situations. It's a philosophical statement. The universe is not singular and unique. Everything that could happen does happen, somewhere. Every version of you exists. And that fact, rather than being comforting, is treated by the show as deeply unsettling. The Season 2 premiere, and an episode called A Wrinkle in Time, is the show at its most explicitly quantum mechanical. The premise involves Rick, Morty, and Summer being temporarily removed from time while Rick repairs a temporal bubble after the events of the previous season finale. When they're reinserted into time, every decision they make causes reality to split, multiplying the timelines. By the end of the episode's first act, there are 64 separate versions of the three of them existing simultaneously, each in a fractionally different timeline, each making slightly different choices. The episode is a direct dramatization of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. The idea that you can't know both the exact position and exact speed of an object simultaneously, that measuring one necessarily disturbs the other. The show handles this not as a physics lecture, but as a source of existential dread that slowly becomes comedic. Rick, who understands what's happening, is frustrated. Morty and Summer, who don't, are terrified. The multiplying timelines are represented visually as split screens that keep subdividing, until you have dozens of tiny boxes each showing a slightly different version of the scene happening slightly differently. It's brilliant and disorienting in equal measure. The relationship between Rick's portal gun and quantum decoherence is also worth examining. In real physics, quantum decoherence is the process by which quantum superpositions, the state of being in multiple possible states simultaneously, collapse into definite outcomes when they interact with their environment. Once a quantum system has decohered, its branches can no longer influence each other. They're effectively isolated. This is mathematically and physically why we can't actually travel between parallel universes even if they exist. The branches have decohered. They're cut off from each other. Rick's portal gun essentially handwaves this problem by postulating a technology that can somehow tunnel between decohered branches, that can find a way through the quantum wall between worlds. Physicists who have talked about the show note that this is the point where the science becomes pure science fiction. But they also note that the show engages with the ideas seriously enough to make the violation feel considered rather than arbitrary. The existence of cesium-137 as the marker for the main Rick's universe of origin is a nice scientific detail. Cesium-137 is a real isotope, a radioactive byproduct of nuclear fission with a half-life of about 30 years. It's one of the isotopes produced in nuclear explosions, and it's used in scientific contexts for radiation dating and other applications. But it's not the most obvious choice for a dimensional designation, which is part of why it works. It has the texture of real scientific nomenclature rather than invented jargon. It suggests that the people who originally designated these dimensions were the kind of people who thought in terms of radioactive isotopes. The show also engages seriously with simulation theory, the philosophical proposition associated with thinkers like Nick Bostrom that we may be living in a computer simulation. The episode in which Morty and Rick play a virtual reality arcade game called Roy, where you live an entire normal human life as a man named Roy who navigates the ordinary pleasures and miseries of existence, plays on the idea that there might be no meaningful distinction between a simulated life and a real one. If the experience is indistinguishable from the inside, what exactly is the difference? Dark matter, which figures into the power source for Rick's spaceship, is also grounded in real scientific discussion. Dark matter is the hypothetical material that most physicists believe accounts for roughly 27% of the universe's total mass energy content, visible only through its gravitational effects on regular matter, rather than through direct detection. A physicist in 2009 theorized a design for a dark matter engine, a spacecraft with an intake system that would collect dark matter particles during travel and use them for propulsion. The show's use of Rick's dark matter-powered ship isn't pulled from nowhere. It's extrapolating from a real proposal. The Hivemind character Unity, whom Rick has a relationship with, draws on real scientific study of collective behavior, group intelligence, and the documented ability of social organisms, from ants to slime molds, to exhibit intelligent collective action without any individual member having full awareness or control of the whole system's decisions. The way Unity spreads and controls populations in the show reflects real observations about how group behavior propagates through networks. Even Rick's claim in an early episode that love is just a chemical reaction, compelling animals to breed, reflects mainstream scientific consensus about the neurochemistry of attachment and romantic bonding. Oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, these are measurable, concrete, hormonal, and neurological processes underlying what humans describe as love. Rick isn't entirely wrong. He's just using accuracy as a weapon to dismiss the possibility of meaning. Part 5, The Heart of It. Rick C. 137's backstory and why it changes everything. Now let's go somewhere quieter and deeper. Let's talk about who Rick Sanchez actually is, beneath the performance, beneath the alcohol, and the genius and the bravado. Let's talk about the backstory that the show spent years building toward and then revealed with remarkable patient restraint. The Rick we follow throughout the show identifies himself as Rick Sanchez C137, which means he originated in Dimension C137. For the first several seasons, many viewers assumed that the family we were watching lived in Dimension C137, that this was the prime reality, the home base. This is not the case, and the distinction turns out to be everything. Dimension C137 is a dimension where Rick's wife Diane and his daughter Beth were killed when Beth was still a child. This means that in Dimension C137, there was never a marriage between Beth and Jerry, never a Summer, never a Morty. The grandchildren Rick has adopted as his family are from a different dimension entirely. He arrived in what the show calls the prime dimension, the one where our Beth survived, where she married Jerry, where Summer and Morty were born, and took the place of that dimension's Rick and Morty after they died in an accidental lab explosion. The deaths of Diane and Beth in C137 were not accidents. This is the central wound of the show, and the show took years to reveal it completely. When it finally did, in Season 3's premiere, and then more fully in Seasons 5 and 7, It recontextualized almost every moment Rick had ever had with his family. Here is what happened. In C-137, Rick was a humble scientist, a family man, working on teleportation technology. He was approached by another version of himself, a Rick from a dimension where that Rick had already discovered interdimensional travel. This other Rick, who the show eventually calls Rick Prime, offered C-137 the secrets of dimensional travel. C-137 refused. He was content. He had Diane. He had Beth. He didn't want to spend his life jumping between realities. He wanted to stay where he was. Rick Prime, insulted by what he saw as a lesser version of himself, acting as though his family were more important than infinite scientific possibility, responded by sending a bomb through a portal. The bomb killed Diane and Beth. It killed them in front of Rick. And then Rick Prime was gone. What happened next is the engine of the entire show, and it runs quietly underneath everything for seasons before the audience fully understands it. Rick, who had been a peaceful family man, was shattered. He went after Rick Prime. Not immediately, but there was grief first, terrible and formless grief. But eventually he invented his own portal gun, and he began hunting through the multiverse for the Rick who had murdered his family. He killed dozens of Ricks, maybe hundreds. He spent years on this hunt, killing any Rick he thought might be Rick Prime, checking them against a genetic signature he'd developed, moving on when they didn't match. He was methodical in the way that only true grief can make a person methodical, applying brilliant intelligence to a quest that was fundamentally about pain. And then he arrived in the dimension where our story takes place. He found a Beth who had survived, who had grown up, who had her own family. He took the place of the dead Rick of that dimension. He moved in with a family that wasn't quite his. And the relationships that developed, complex, prickly, genuinely loving underneath all the dysfunction, were between a man who had lost everything and the closest approximation to what he'd lost that the multiverse could offer him. This is why Rick's feelings about Morty are so complex and so powerful. Morty is not his original grandson. There is no Morty in Dimension C-137. Diane and Beth died before Morty could have existed. Morty is a borrowed relationship. It's one that Rick has chosen to maintain, even though maintaining it requires emotional investment that Rick has spent decades training himself not to make. Every time Rick shows that he loves Morty, which he does in his oblique and frequently destructive way, he is choosing something that his pain and his philosophy both argue against. He is choosing connection in spite of everything. Season 5's finale and Season 7's continuation revealed something even darker layered underneath this. Rick Prime, who we come to understand was motivated by a particular kind of narcissistic rage. The fury of a Rick who believed that attachment to family was weakness, who wanted all Ricks to share his contempt for domestic life, did not stop with killing Diane and Beth in C-137. But he developed what the show calls the Omega device, a weapon capable of erasing a single person not just in one dimension, but in all dimensions simultaneously. And he used it on Diane. He wiped her from the entire multiverse. This is why, across dozens of episodes, viewers who were paying attention never encountered a version of Diane in any of the alternate dimensions. It wasn't oversight. Every Rick who had ever met the real Rick Prime and received the offer of dimensional travel, the offer that C-137 refused, lost their Diane. She was erased from everywhere, leaving a universe full of Ricks who had all been made motherless by the same act of petty, catastrophic cruelty. Rick eventually found and killed Rick Prime. He caught up to his nemesis in a Season 7 episode, with evil Morty assisting and tracking him down. And he beat Rick Prime to death with his bare hands. And then, and this is the part the show handles with devastating quietness, he was empty. He had organized his entire existence around this one thing, this one pursuit, and when it was over, there was nothing left to fill the space. The anger had become a home, and now the home was gone. The Diane AI that Rick created in his original dimension, a voice system that played recordings of Diane calling to him from the other room, maintaining the fiction of her presence, captures something heartbreaking about how Rick has managed this grief. He didn't try to find a replacement. He didn't let himself heal. He built a machine to simulate the sound of someone he lost, and then subjected himself to it alone in an empty house. And in a dimension, he had locked in a time loop around the worst day of his life. Part 6, The Writer's Room, The Story Circle, and How Each Episode is Actually Made. The process of writing. Rick and Morty has always been something the show's creators have been unusually open about, in part because it's genuinely interesting, and in part because Dan Harmon's particular approach to storytelling, systematic, structural, almost architectural, is something he believes in deeply enough to share. Harmon developed what he calls the story circle, a simplified adaptation of mythologist Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero's journey. The story circle has 8 stages, arranged in a circle rather than a linear sequence. A character is in a zone of comfort, they want something, they enter an unfamiliar situation, they adapt to that situation. They get what they wanted, they pay a price for it, they return to their familiar situation, and they've changed as a result. Harmon argues that virtually all satisfying stories can be mapped onto this shape, and that failing to follow this shape is why many stories feel unsatisfying even when individual moments are good. What's unusual about how Rick and Morty applies this framework is that it applies it twice simultaneously. In most episodes, there are 2 parallel stories running, Rick and Morty's adventure plot and the family's domestic subplot, and both of them move through the story circle at the same time. The show then finds moments where the 2 circles of story intersect or comment on each other, creating the distinctive sense that everything is happening at once and nothing is accidental. This structural discipline is what allows the show to do something remarkable. It can generate genuine emotional payoffs in episodes that are also wildly absurd, because the emotional beats are positioned where the story circle says they should be, which is also where the audience's nervous system is primed to receive them. You're laughing at a concept that's ridiculous, and then you're suddenly feeling something real, and the feeling real doesn't come as a surprise because the story's structure prepared you for it even if its content didn't. Harmon described the Rick and Morty writer's room as significantly smaller than what he'd had on Community, and significantly more informal, what he called rough and tumble verbally. The first season writing staff consisted of Roiland, Harmon, Tom Kaufman, Ryan Ridley, Wade Randolph, and Eric Acosta, with writer's assistant Mike McMahon receiving writing credit as well. A tiny group of people making a show that would eventually draw tens of millions of viewers. The process begins with what the writers call breaking a story, talking through the major beats of an episode's narrative in the writer's room until the shape of the thing becomes clear. Once the shape is agreed on, a specific writer is assigned to develop the outline and then the script. The name that appears in the opening credits of an episode is usually that writer, the person who broke the story into its final form, though the ideas inside it will have been generated collectively and refined through multiple rounds of feedback. One structural principle the show developed early was that for Rick and Morty, now the amount of story it could tell in 5 minutes would be enough for a full episode of most other shows. Writer Sarah Carbiner, one of the writers who joined in Season 3, noted that plots which other series would sustain for an entire episode were compressed into the first few minutes of a Rick and Morty episode, and then the show moved past them to something else. This creates the sense of velocity that the show is known for. The feeling that things are happening faster than you can quite process them, that the story has already moved on from the thing you were processing. The improvisational element in the recording booth adds another layer of texture to the writing. When Roiland recorded his performances as both Rick and Morty, he would often go off script in productive ways, finding line readings in moments that the written dialogue hadn't anticipated. These improvised moments, the alts he called them, were recorded alongside the scripted versions, and the editorial process involved choosing which version served the episode best. Some of the show's most memorable moments have origins in these improvised passes rather than the written script. Roiland described his recording method for doing both voices. He would do some Rick first, then switch to Morty and record all of Morty's lines, then go back and do all of Rick, then revisit any scenes he specifically wanted to explore further. The logistical challenge of voicing both sides of a conversation in the same room without actually having anyone to bounce off led to a particular quality in the performances, an introspective, self-contained energy where each character was being inhabited fully on its own terms, rather than in reaction to another performer. This changed for season 7 onward, when Ian Cardone took over Rick and Harry Belden took over Morty after Justin Roiland's departure from the show. One of the more surprising revelations from Cardone and Belden's interviews about their experience is that they also don't record together. Despite what viewers might assume about the natural-seeming chemistry between Rick and Morty in their scenes, the two voice actors record in separate locations, layering their performances onto each other in post-production. The fact that this feels spontaneous is a testament to how well both performers understand their characters and to the editorial skill of the team putting the final product together. About Part 7, the Great Szechuan Sauce Saga. When a single joke changed. McDonald's menu. There is no stranger chapter in the history of Rick and Morty's cultural impact than the Szechuan Sauce Saga, and it deserves to be told in full because it is a story about how a joke in an animated TV show rippled outward into the physical world with consequences nobody anticipated. In April 2017, Adult Swim aired the Season 3 premiere, The Rick Shank Rickdemption, as an unannounced April Fool's Day surprise. The episode picks up where Season 2's cliffhanger left off, with Rick imprisoned by the Galactic Federation. In the episode's opening minutes, a Federation agent named Cornelius Daniel enters Rick's mind to extract the formula for interdimensional travel. Now, and Rick uses the opportunity to lead the agent on a tour of his memories, including a visit to a McDonald's drive-thru in the 1990s, where he orders chicken McNuggets with Szechuan sauce. Szechuan sauce was a real thing. McDonald's had briefly offered it in 1998 as a promotional tie-in for the Disney animated film Mulan. It was a teriyaki-based dipping sauce with notes of soy and sesame, available for about a month before disappearing from the menu entirely. It was popular among the people who tried it, but it vanished into the archive of discontinued fast food items, a category that most condiments belong to permanently once they're gone. The episode uses the sauce as a comedic through-line. Rick keeps referencing it, clearly having a genuine affection for this specific piece of 1998 fast food nostalgia. And then, at the end of the episode, in a speech to Morty that reframes his apparent heroism as actually self-serving, Rick reveals his true motivation: not saving his family, not defeating the Galactic Federation. The Szechuan sauce. He wants the Mulan McNugget sauce, and if it takes 9 seasons to get it, that's how long he'll go. The joke was perfect in multiple ways. It was absurdist in the Rick and Morty mode, taking something genuinely trivial and treating it with complete seriousness. It had a nostalgic texture that resonated with the show's core audience, who were the right age to have vague memories of 1998 promotional foods. And it was specific enough with the actual brand name and the actual movie referenced to feel real rather than generic. The fan response was immediate and intense. Within days, nearly 50,000 people had signed a change.org petition asking McDonald's to bring back the Szechuan sauce. They were not joking. They actually wanted the sauce. The scale of this desire, generated by a single throwaway moment in an animated comedy, surprised everyone, including the people at McDonald's. McDonald's, to their credit, responded. They made a small batch of the sauce and sent it directly to the show's creators, a 4-pound jug for Justin Roiland and the writer's room, accompanied by a letter that was a masterwork of corporate playfulness. The letter described the sauce as having been retrieved from Dimension C-1998M, a dimension where it's always 1998. The McDonald's test kitchen had essentially written Rick and Morty fanfiction to explain where they'd found a sauce that was discontinued 2 decades earlier. Roiland posted a photo of the jug on social media. The internet exploded. McDonald's then made the decision to bring the sauce back for a single day, October 7, 2017, at participating locations across the United States. The operative word there is participating. Not all locations had the sauce, and those that did had received quantities that were wildly insufficient for the demand. The planning, in retrospect, was catastrophically optimistic. What happened on October 7, 2017 was best described as a small cultural event that got out of control. Fans lined up at McDonald's locations hours before they opened, some having crossed state lines to attend. Couples drove from Canada to American border towns specifically for the sauce. When locations ran out, which most did very quickly, People became angry in ways that surprised the McDonald's employees who were just trying to get through a shift. Crowds chanted, "We want sauce," outside at least one location. Police were called to manage crowds at several restaurants. A video went viral of someone jumping over a counter in distress. Individual sauce packets began appearing on eBay for hundreds of dollars. A single 64-ounce jug of the original 1998 vintage sauce, found in an old car by the seller, sold for nearly $14,700. McDonald's issued an apology. They acknowledged that they had badly miscalculated the scale of the demand, and they promised a proper re-release with adequate supply. That re-release came in February 2018, when the company produced an estimated 20 million portions of the sauce and distributed them to locations nationwide. The chaos of October was not repeated. The sauce was available, people got it, and the bizarre saga reached something like a resolution. The show maintained the joke across subsequent seasons, treating the sauce as a recurring element of Rick's character without beating it to death. The cultural conversation around the sauce, and around the behavior of Rick and Morty's fandom during the shortage, became its own story, one about the strange power that media properties can have when they connect with the right audience at the right moment. There is a certain irony in the fact that the sauce, which in the show represents Rick's most absurdly trivial motivation, inspired behavior in the real world that was arguably more motivated and organized than the character's actual galaxy-saving adventures. People planned cross-border road trips for a condiment. They camped overnight. They hired proxies for a McDonald's dipping sauce. Part 8. Hidden in plain sight. Easter eggs, callbacks, and the details you were supposed to miss. Rick and Morty rewards close attention in ways that most animated shows don't. There is a particular pleasure in rewatching episodes and noticing things that weren't visible on first viewing. Things hidden in the background, planted in frames that go by too quickly for conscious registration, or seeded in early episodes as setup for payoffs that won't arrive for seasons. One of the most celebrated examples of this is the Gravity Falls connection. Gravity Falls was a Disney XD animated series created by Alex Hirsch, a friend of Justin Roiland's, about a pair of twins who spend a summer with their great-uncle in a small Pacific Northwest town full of supernatural secrets. Roiland and Hirsch were friends from the independent animation community in Los Angeles and had discussed the possibility of a crossover between their shows. The crossover never officially happened. The shows existed on different networks with different audiences, but a subtle, unofficial connection was planted in both. In a Gravity Falls episode called Society of the Blind Eye, the character Grunkle Stan loses several specific items through a large portal: a notebook, a pen, and a yellow coffee mug with a question mark on it. These items vanish into the portal and do not reappear in Gravity Falls. And several months later, in a Rick and Morty episode called Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, Rick opens multiple portals in rapid succession while trying to evade pursuing Ricks. Through one of those portals, several specific items tumble out and land briefly on screen before the scene moves on. A notebook, a pen, and a yellow coffee mug with a question mark on it. The Gravity Falls items ended up in Rick and Morty's universe. The Gravity Falls episode aired a full year before the Rick and Morty episode that contained the items. The timing of this cross-show Easter egg required planning and coordination between the two shows' teams, a quiet collaboration that resulted in a detail visible only to people watching both shows attentively. The pilot episode of Rick and Morty, when it enters the interdimensional customs zone, contains a background shot that is essentially a game of Where's Waldo for science fiction fans. Packed into a crowd of alien silhouettes are recognizable shapes from a remarkable range of pop culture: the alien from the Alien franchise, a prawn from the film District 9, Tom Servo and Crow T. Robot from Mystery Science Theater 3000, a silhouette from Space Invaders, and, in a detail so small you need to pause the episode to see it, figures from Aqua Teen Hunger Force's Mooninites. The show introduced itself with a visual love letter to the science fiction that preceded it. Rick's bedroom, seen in a post-credits scene in Season 1, contains a conspiracy board on his wall. Strings connecting photographs in the way detective boards and conspiracy corkboards do in crime dramas. The photographs on the wall are a mix of characters from episodes that have already happened and visible in advance, a character from an episode that hasn't aired yet. Aberdolf Linkler, Rick's disastrous attempt to create a morally neutral superleader by combining the DNA of Adolf Hitler and Abraham Lincoln, appears on Rick's conspiracy board in the episode before the episode where Aberdolf Linkler is introduced. The parasites from the Season 2 episode Total Rickle, creatures that implant false memories to disguise themselves as beloved family friends, were foreshadowed 2 episodes before their introduction. At the end of the episode Morty Night Run, Rick can be seen loading glowing green geodes into his spaceship, and in the background, careful viewers can spot small pink parasite eggs adhering to the rocks. Rick brought the parasites into the house himself, before anyone knew they existed, by carrying contaminated materials home from an adventure. The Harmonious Claptrap, Dan Harmon's personal production company vanity card that appears at the end of each episode, has changed over the seasons in ways that reflect his personal life. In Seasons 1 and 2, the card shows Harmon on a couch with his wife and their pets, everyone smiling. After Season 2 aired, Harmon and his wife divorced. The vanity card changed to show Harmon alone on the same couch, surrounded by his pets, with bottles of alcohol and detritus around him. The production of a Rick and Morty episode ends with an image of its creator's life changing in real time. Since Season 4, after Harmon entered a new relationship with writer and producer Cody Heller, the card has changed again to a warmer image. The Truth Tortoise scene in Season 3's Morty's Mind Blowers is one of the show's most committed Easter eggs. The Truth Tortoise, as the episode presents it, is a creature that reveals all truths to whoever looks into its eyes. Morty looks into its eyes, and what the tortoise says is heard as indistinct mumbling. If you take that mumbling and play it backward, you can hear Justin Roiland's muffled voice saying, "Paul is dead. I'm a beetle." This is a reference to the long-standing conspiracy theory that Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was secretly replaced by a look-alike, with the surviving Beatles allegedly embedding clues about this in their music, including reversed messages hidden in songs. If the show hit a joke about Paul McCartney being dead inside an already layered joke about a tortoise that reveals all truth, you have to reverse the audio of an animated background moment to find it. There is a Doctor Who Easter egg in Season 3's The Ricklantis Mix-Up. The episode, which takes place entirely on the Citadel of Ricks, contains a crowd scene in which, visible briefly if you pause the episode, there is a Rick dressed in clothing that is unmistakably referencing the 4th Doctor from Doctor Who, including the long scarf that Tom Baker's version of the character was known for. The show acknowledged a debt to Doctor Who as one of its inspirations, and this background Easter egg is its way of leaving a thank you note. During Season 1's autoerotic assimilation, the episode in which Rick reunites with his ex-lover Unity, a collective hive mind that controls entire populations, Rick instructs Unity to produce a custom television show for his entertainment. The show Unity creates is clearly an alien version of Community. The same cast arrangement, the same study table setup, the same dynamics of a group of mismatched people navigating an educational institution together. Rick then proceeds to give notes on the show, asking for the characters to mock the blonde one and then to perform various increasingly complicated scenarios, in what amounts to Dan Harmon writing a scene in which his own show is being art-directed by a drunk alien. Several Community cast members, including Joel McHale, Gillian Jacobs, and Jim Rash, have appeared as guest voices in Rick and Morty across various seasons. Part 9, the guest stars, the voices you know, and the art of the cameo. One of the pleasures of watching Rick and Morty with close attention is listening for familiar voices in unexpected places. The show has always been generous with its guest casting, and over the years it has assembled a remarkable roster of performers who have passed through the Rick and Morty universe. Susan Sarandon voiced Dr. Wong in Pickle Rick, the family therapist whose quiet precision dismantles Rick's defenses more effectively than any alien threat has managed. Sarandon brought a particular quality to the role, a calmness that was neither warm nor cold, just rigorous, the voice of someone who has heard every kind of defense mechanism and is no longer surprised by any of them. The character is brief but essential, and having Sarandon voice her gives the moment a particular gravity. Nathan Fillion, as the actor best known for Firefly and Castle, voiced the Galactic Federation agent Cornelius Daniel in the Season 3 premiere. The agent who enters Rick's memories trying to extract the portal formula, and who ends up being played by Rick rather than playing Rick. It's a small role in terms of screen time, but pivotal to the episode, and Fillion brings a specific kind of earnest professionalism to the character that makes the moment when Rick turns the tables on him land with particular satisfaction. Joel McHale, Gillian Jacobs, and Jim Rash, all from Dan Harmon's Community, have appeared across different episodes, representing Harmon's tendency to keep the creative community around him intact. Danny Trejo voiced Jaguar in Pickle Rick, the trained assassin tasked with killing Pickle Rick on behalf of the Russian criminal organization. Trejo is someone whose presence in a role carries immediate physical authority, and the show uses that effectively. Christian Slater voiced Vance Maximus, leader of the Vindicators. Stephen Colbert appeared as a character in a Season 2 episode. Dana Carvey, Claudia Black, and Rich Fulcher have all made appearances. Dan Harmon himself voiced Bird Person and the cyborg version Phoenix Person. This is worth noting for a moment. Harmon is not a professional voice actor. He has described his vocal work as amateur. And yet Bird Person became one of the most emotionally important characters in the show's history. And Harmon's performance as him carries a specific gravity that a more polished voice actor might not have found. And there's something in the slight awkwardness, the sense of someone not quite performing a role but thinking through it, that suits Bird Person's particular combination of dignity and genuine feeling. Chris Parnell, who voices Jerry Smith, came to the role through his extensive background in comedy voice work and sketch performance. He was a regular cast member on Saturday Night Live. Parnell has spoken about finding Jerry's particular rhythms of self-delusion and genuine sweetness, the way Jerry is both more annoying and more endearing than any single aspect of his character suggests. He has made Jerry feel specific rather than generic, which is harder than it sounds. Jerry could easily become a punchline without dimension, but Parnell consistently finds the dignity underneath the embarrassment. Sarah Chalk, who voices Beth Smith, brought her experience from long-running medical and family comedies to a role that required navigating between genuine emotion and deeply unsympathetic behavior, often within the same scene. Beth is not always a likable character. She enables Rick in ways that harm her children. She can be cruel to Jerry in ways that go beyond marital frustration. And Chalky makes all of this feel like it comes from a real person, rather than a collection of character tics, which is what allows the audience to remain invested in Beth's arc rather than dismissing her. Spencer Grammer, who voices Summer, is the daughter of actor Kelsey Grammer. She has given Summer a particular quality of performed confidence over genuine anxiety, the voice of a teenager who is cooler on the outside than she is on the inside, which is, of course, all teenagers everywhere. But the evolution of Summer across seasons, from essentially a background character in the first season to a formidable presence in the show's later mythology, is supported by Grammer's ability to let the character grow without losing her essential self. Part 10. The music beyond the theme. Songs, scores, and the sonic world of the show. Ryan Elder's work as the show's composer goes far beyond the opening theme. He has created, over the show's run, a genuinely varied musical world that operates in dialogue with each episode's emotional and narrative needs. The show's approach to its score reflects Justin Roiland's original directive. Take the science fiction seriously. The music is not comic book music, not winking at the absurdity of what's happening on screen. It plays everything straight, which creates the show's characteristic emotional layering. You're laughing at something, but the music beneath it is treating it as though it matters, which means the sadness or the wonder underneath the joke can come through. Some of the show's musical moments have become famous in their own right. The song Goodbye Moonman, from the Season 2 episode Morty Night Run, was written and performed by the Flight of the Conchords member Jermaine Clement. The episode involves a gaseous entity named Fart, literally a gaseous being that communicates through music, who Rick and Morty encounter while transporting a fugitive. Fart's big song, Goodbye Moonmen, is performed with complete sincerity as a kind of psychedelic space ballad. It is completely ridiculous and genuinely beautiful, which is the show's exact frequency. Get Swifty. That's the original song that Rick and Morty perform in Season 2 to satisfy the demands of alien overlords who require Earth's most impressive musical act, has a life outside the episode. It became a fan favorite, something people actually listen to outside of the context of the show. Justin Roiland co-wrote the song, which required finding a musical register that was both genuinely catchy and deliberately terrible, the song of geniuses performing pop music that isn't their genre, with all the awkward energy that implies. the song for the Damaged Coda by the band Blonde Redhead, which plays at the reveal moment in Season 1's close Rick counters of the Rick kind when Eye Patch Morty is revealed to be the mastermind. And then again at the end of Season 3's Ricklantis mix-up, when we learn that Eye Patch Morty has become the president of the Citadel, has become Evil Morty's unofficial theme. The show licensed the song twice, using it for the same character in 2 different seasons, creating a musical through-line across the show's mythology. If you hear that song, something significant about Evil Morty is happening. The musical duo Chaos Chaos, which performed the song Can You Feel It? From the Season 2 episode Autoerotic Assimilation. The song that plays over the montage of Rick and Unity's relationship in full swing across an entire planet's population. Also collaborated with Roiland on an original song called Terry Folds for the Season 3 episode Rest and Ricklaxation. The song plays in Rick's car during a quiet drive home after a spa adventure, and it has a melancholic warmth that encapsulates what that episode is about. The possibility, briefly glimpsed, of Rick being at peace. Elder described his approach to the Parasites episode Total Recall as one of his favorite creative challenges. The episode required him to move constantly between the horror of bloody combat and the warmth of happy memories, just switching emotional registers between scenes in a way that could have felt jarring. He achieved this by developing distinct musical languages for each mode. The horror sequences get something tense and dissonant, while the memory sequences get something soft and nostalgic. And trusting the editing to make those transitions feel intentional rather than abrupt. The Truth Tortoise Easter egg mentioned earlier, the backward audio revealing a Paul McCartney conspiracy message, required Elder to actually compose something that would sound like plausible tortoise speak forward but contain coherent English content when reversed. This kind of compositional puzzle is the sort of thing that gets included in a show where the people making it are genuinely enjoying the process of hiding things for attentive viewers to find. Part 11, The April Fool's Miracle, record-breaking seasons, and the 70-episode deal. The story of Rick and Morty's rise from cult animated show to the #1 comedy on American television. For adults between 18 and 34 is a story about patience, scarcity, and the particular power of an audience that would rather wait forever than move on. Season 2 ended in October 2015 on a massive cliffhanger. Rick, facing consequences for his actions that had accumulated across the season, surrendered himself to the Galactic Federation, an alien governmental body that had been hunting him, to protect his family. He was imprisoned on a distant planet. The family was left scattered-eyed. Jerry and Beth's marriage, already under strain, continued to deteriorate. And then silence. For a year and a half, the delay between Season 2 and Season 3 became, in its own way, part of the Rick and Morty story. Fans didn't know when the show was coming back. There were rumors of production trouble, rumors of creative disagreements between Harmon and Roiland that had slowed things down. The silence was genuinely uncertain. It wasn't announced as a planned hiatus, and the longer it went on, the more the fandom existed in a state of collective suspension, watching and waiting. Adult Swim's creative director, Mike Lazo, had an idea. April Fool's Day 2017 was approaching, and Adult Swim had a tradition of pulling stunts on that date, airing unusual content, surprising viewers with things they weren't expecting. Lazo's idea was to air the Season 3 premiere of Rick and Morty on April 1st with zero warning, no marketing, no announcement. Just put it on. Let the audience find it. Both Harmon and Roiland were terrified by this plan. Harmon was specifically worried about the April Fool's framing. He was afraid that when word spread that the premiere was airing, people would assume the announcement was the joke, that there was no actual new episode, and that no one would tune in. The prank would be that there was no prank, but nobody would trust that. He thought it would backfire catastrophically. It didn't. On the evening of April 1st, 2017, Adult Swim quietly began airing The Rick Shank Rickdemption, the Season 3 premiere. The first airing at 8 in the evening drew around 676,000 viewers. Strong, but not spectacular. Then word started spreading. Social media lit up. People were texting each other. Journalists were asking whether this was real. The episode ran again. More people tuned in. It ran again after that. By the time the evening was over, the premiere had attracted 5 million total viewers and generated another 3 million unique viewers online. It had become unavoidable. If you were on the internet that night, Royland later said, you couldn't escape it. The episode then looped continuously into the early hours of the morning, bumping other Adult Swim programming to repeat slots. Adult Swim scheduled a re-airing the following week with advance notice. The internet engagement numbers were unprecedented for the show. The Adult Swim livestream of the premiere registered 3 million unique visitors, and then Facebook hosting of the event generated 43 million impressions and 8.7 million video views combined. When the rest of Season 3 began airing weekly in July 2017, the numbers only grew. The season set records that Adult Swim had never seen. Season 3 became the highest-rated season in Adult Swim's history as a network. The second episode of the season was the single most watched episode in the show's history at that point, drawing 2.86 million viewers, and was the second best-rated cable telecast of the day it aired, behind only the weekly Game of Thrones episode. Season 3's finale was the most-watched telecast of the day across all age groups. The show had become not just a cult favorite, but a genuine mainstream ratings phenomenon. That same year, in May 2018, following the season's conclusion, Adult Swim and the show's creators announced an extraordinary deal: 70 new episodes of Rick and Morty over an unspecified number of seasons. Not a renewal for a specific number of seasons, but a commitment to continue the story for 70 more episodes, period. This was the kind of deal that signaled absolute confidence in the property. The network essentially saying that however many seasons it took to tell 70 episodes, they wanted all of them. This deal was significant for creative reasons beyond its commercial implications. With 70 episodes guaranteed, the writers could plan longer story arcs with confidence. They didn't have to worry about cancellation mid-arc. They could seed things in Season 4, knowing they'd have the space to pay them off in Season 6 or 7. But the central finite curve, which became one of the show's most significant concepts, was foreshadowed in dialogue from Season 1. A throwaway line in a Council of Rick's scene that seemed like world-building flavor, but was actually an early reference to something the writers were planning to develop years later. The 70-episode deal also, less happily, was announced at a time when the relationship between Harmon and Royland behind the scenes was becoming complicated in ways neither was publicly discussing. Royland had, by some accounts, begun to disengage from day-to-day production. He was showing up less, participating less in the writer's room, leaving more of the structural work to Harmon and the writing staff. Adult Swim executive Mike Lazo noticed the imbalance and is reported to have observed it to people around him. The show's creative center of gravity was shifting, without anyone acknowledging it publicly. Part 12, Pickle Rick, Emmy Night, and the Philosophy da Shui. The show hides in its funniest moments. On August 6, 2017, during the summer run of Season 3 episodes, Rick and Morty aired an episode that would become arguably the most famous thing the show had ever done. The episode was called Pickle Rick. Its premise was announced at the end of the previous episode. Rick had turned himself into a pickle. The origin of the idea is itself a small case study in how the show's writer's room worked. Someone, accounts vary on exactly who, suggested beginning an episode with Rick as a pickle. Just as a starting point to see where the conversation went. In most writers' rooms, this would be a throwaway, absurdist suggestion, the kind of thing that gets laughed at and discarded. But in a Rick and Morty writer's room, the question that followed was exactly the right one. Why would Rick turn himself into a pickle? The first answer was because he could, because he wanted to prove something to himself, because he was Rick. And Rick does things like this. But as the conversation continued, a deeper answer emerged. Because Rick didn't want to go to family therapy. The show's Season 3 arc involved the divorce of Beth and Jerry, and the writers had been looking for a way to continue exploring what that meant for the family. Rick's transformation into a pickle became a way to avoid the family therapy session that would force him to confront his own role in the family's dysfunction. He turned himself into a pickle rather than sit in a room and talk about his feelings. That is a profound and specific kind of emotional avoidance. The episode was written by Jessica Gao, who had joined the writing staff for Season 3. Gao structured it as a dual narrative. In one strand, Rick in pickle form was dropped into a sewer, built a rat exoskeleton using only his pickle body and the teeth and claws of dead rats, escaped the sewer, infiltrated a government building, fought through a series of increasingly dangerous operatives, and ultimately found his way home. In the parallel strand, Beth, Summer, and Morty attended the family therapy session without Rick, where a brilliant therapist named Dr. Wong, voiced by Susan Sarandon, gently destroyed the family's defenses and revealed the dysfunction underneath. The episode was, in technical terms, a parody of action films, specifically of John Wick's style of choreographed, consequential action, and of Breaking Bad's Season 2, Episode 4 Days Out, in which Walter White was stranded in the desert and had to use chemistry to survive. But it was also a genuine and precise piece of character writing about Rick's terror of being ordinary, of having to sit with the simple, boring, unglamorous work of being a person in a family. Dr. Wong's speech at the end of the episode, in which she tells Rick that his genius allows him to avoid the simple, boring work that most people do to make their relationships function, is the episode's real payload. Rick turns himself into a pickle not because it's interesting or necessary, but because it's more interesting than therapy. And Rick would rather do almost anything than do the unglamorous, non-special, non-genius labor of actually showing up for people. Dr. Wong says it clearly. He uses his intelligence to run from the work of being a person. The pickle is the armor. The genius is the wall. In September 2018, the Television Academy gave Pickle Rick the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. It was Rick and Morty's first Emmy, and it arrived for the episode that most fully dramatized the show's central philosophical preoccupation, the relationship between intelligence, avoidance, and the terror of ordinary human connection. The show would win a second Emmy in 2020 for the Vat of Acid episode from Season 4, an episode in which Morty demands that Rick build him a device that functions as a reset button for his own life, and allowing him to live multiple versions of events and choose the best outcome. Rick builds the device, Morty uses it to live an entire relationship with a girl, falling in love across months of his life, and then discovers that the device didn't actually reset anything. It created parallel realities in which Morty's choices caused real consequences and real deaths. The girl of his dreams is gone. The peace he found during that relationship is permanently unavailable. The reset button was always a lie. 2 Emmy wins, both for episodes about the same thing: the desire to escape consequences and the impossibility of actually doing so. Part 13. Wubba Luba Dub. Dub and Other Secrets of the Language in Rick and Morty is funnier and stranger than it first appears. But the show's catchphrases and invented words carry their own backstory, and some of them are quite different from what viewers assume. Rick's signature exclamation, "Wubba Lubba Dub Dub," which the show uses repeatedly across its early seasons, was eventually given a meaning in Bird Person's appearance in Season 1. In Bird Person's language, it translates to, "I am in great pain, please help me." This transforms every utterance of a seemingly nonsense catchphrase into a genuine cry for help from a character who cannot express his suffering directly. Rick's silly noise is, in the language of his closest friend, a distress signal. Composer Ryan Elder noted that this moment, Bird Person quietly translating the phrase for Morty, was the scene that defined the show's emotional register for him, and the one that showed him what kind of show this actually was. The actual origin of the phrase within the writer's room is considerably less poetic. Writer Ryan Ridley has said it started as a hacky placeholder for another line, a variation on the whoop 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 sound Curly from the Three Stooges makes. The original script apparently had something like wobble gobble lop glops as a placeholder, and when Roiland recorded the voice performance, he tried various improvised nonsense phrases until wooba looba dub dub emerged as the version that felt right. Dan Harmon, who generally did not like catchphrases, kept it. The Bird Person translation came later, recontextualizing the joke as tragedy. The word squanch and its variants, used extensively by the character Squanchy, is another piece of deliberate linguistic construction. Squanchy uses the word squanch as a verb, noun, adjective, and adverb, letting context determine its meaning in any given sentence. The writers designed the word to function as a kind of universal linguistic placeholder, something that can slot into any grammatical role and carry any meaning the surrounding sentence requires. It's a functional parody of how profanity actually works in language, where a small set of highly flexible words can carry enormous semantic range depending on usage and tone. The show's episode titles, when viewed as a collection, contain their own texture. They are uniformly pun-based. combining the names Rick and Morty with references to other films and shows. Lawnmower Dog for the Lawnmower Man, Something Rick Mountain. This Way Comes for Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes. Close Rick Counters of the Rick, Kind for Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Rickmancing the Stone for Romancing the Stone, Vindicators 3 for the Avengers format, and dozens more. The show originally acknowledged its own episode title format with a meta-joke in which Rick notes that their adventures need memorable names, immediately calling attention to the pun structure. The show's television listings and streaming descriptions, the episode summaries that appear when you hover over or click on an episode, were written by Justin Roiland himself for the first several seasons. These descriptions are notoriously strange, often having nothing to do with the episode's actual content, sometimes written in Rick's voice, sometimes written in a completely different voice that seems to belong to no character at all. So they were Roiland treating the metadata of the show's distribution as another canvas for comedy. Part 15, Season 7 and the Transition. New Voices for an Old Universe. In January 2023, a report from NBC News revealed that Justin Roiland had been charged with felony domestic battery and false imprisonment in Orange County, California, in connection with an alleged incident from early 2020. The charges were later dropped in March 2023 due to insufficient evidence, but the reporting had already set a chain of events in motion that would permanently change the show. Adult Swim announced in January 2023 that they had severed ties with Roiland. His voice roles, Rick and Morty themselves, along with several recurring characters including Mr. Poopy Butthole, would be recast for Season 7. The show would continue with new actors. This announcement was made while Season 7 was already in production, adding significant logistical weight to what was already a difficult situation. The process of finding new voices was extensive. The team auditioned thousands of candidates, not looking for exact matches, but for people who understood the emotional core of both characters deeply enough to inhabit them rather than simply imitate them. Dan Harmon, by his own account, largely removed himself from the audition process, finding it emotionally difficult to be objective when the question was how closely a stranger's voice resembled his collaborators. He was brought in only at the very end of the process, when the field had been narrowed to a few final candidates. The two actors selected were Ian Cardoni as Rick and Harry Belden as Morty, and neither was particularly well known before their selection. Both described the experience of being cast as surreal, not quite believing that they had won roles that millions of people had applied for, that they were now the primary voices of characters who were, in the words of Adult Swim's announcement, among the most recognized animated characters in the world. Cardoni and Belden have spoken candidly about the challenge of their task. Harmon described the goal as making the performances indistinguishable from what preceded them. Not because the new actors were expected to simply copy Roiland, but because the characters had an established presence and feel that needed to be maintained for the story's continuity to hold. The new actors, for their part, they emphasized that they approached the characters from the inside out, understanding who Rick and Morty were at an emotional level, what they wanted, what they feared, what their voices expressed about their inner life, rather than starting from the surface vocal texture and working inward. The reveal of the new voices happened when Season 7 premiered on October 15, 2023. The new Rick and Morty voices were Ian Cardoni and Harry Belden, announced at the premiere broadcast without advance notice of the specific actors, a small echo of the April Fool's Day strategy that had launched Season 3, the choice to let the thing speak for itself, rather than manage expectations with pre-release information. The critical and fan response was broadly positive, more positive by most accounts than many had expected. The characters felt recognizable. The storytelling felt consistent. The show's voice had changed in the literal sense while remaining continuous in the emotional and philosophical sense. The production of animation was also shifting around this time. Mercury Filmworks in Ottawa, Canada joined the production with Season 9, and Lighthouse Studios in Kilkenny, Ireland came on for Season 7. The team producing the visual world of the show was growing and evolving, reflecting the show's expansion into a genuinely industrial-scale production while retaining the specific visual language that viewers had come to recognize over a decade. Season 8, as of the time these facts were assembled, was in production and airing weekly. The show continued, but Part 16, The Characters Who Got Away. One episode wonders and the details you might have missed. Rick and Morty is a show where minor characters often carry more weight than their screen time suggests. And part of the pleasure of the show's universe is the accumulation of detail around figures who appear briefly and disappear. Mr. Poopy Butthole is the most extreme example of this. He is a small yellow creature who appears to have always been a friend of the Smith family, showing up in the Season 2 episode Total Recall as one of the characters the family has to determine is either a real friend or a parasite implant. His defining trait, relentless, unwavering warmth, makes him look exactly like a parasite, since the episode's logic is that parasites can only create positive memories. Beth shoots him. He turns out to be real. But the moment reframes the entire episode. The character who seemed most obviously fake was the most genuinely good. What follows, across several seasons' worth of post-credits scenes, is a quietly devastating character arc. Mr. Poopy Butthole recovers from being shot. He goes to physical therapy. He goes to school. He falls in love and gets married. He has a child. He ages. He goes through difficult things. And through all of it, his warmth persists. Not as naive ignorance of pain, but as a genuine choice, made repeatedly, to remain open and kind in spite of everything. He breaks the fourth wall and speaks directly to the audience, and because he is so consistently warm, it actually lands as genuine connection rather than a trick. The Vindicators, who appear in Season 3's Vindicators 3, The Return of Worldender, are Rick and Morty's version of superhero team parody. But within the episode, they function as something more interesting, a demonstration of what happens when heroes are celebrated but not held to account. The Vindicators are genuinely heroic in the sense of having saved billions of lives, but they're also flawed, selfish, and then in some cases, doing real harm in their personal lives. Rick, who has worked with them before, is contemptuous of how they get to be treated as heroic, while he, who has saved equally many lives and arguably more, is treated as a villain. The episode is about the performance of heroism versus its substance, and it treats the distinction seriously enough to make the viewer feel genuinely uncomfortable. Bird Person, who becomes Phoenix Person after being killed and cybernetically rebuilt by the Galactic Federation, represents one of the show's longest-running emotional investments. The transformation of Rick's closest friend into an instrument of the organization that has been hunting him is brutal in a specific way. It's not just the loss of a person, but the weaponization of a relationship. When Rick encounters Phoenix Person, he doesn't fight him as an enemy. He fights him the way you fight someone you love who has been hurt into hurting you. The emotional register of those scenes is grief, not rage. Jerry Smith, consistently the butt of jokes, consistently underestimated by everyone including the show's audience, actually has a quiet record of unlikely competence throughout the series. He survived on an alien planet on his own in Season 2, managing by talking his way through situations and relying on social skills that nobody credits him with having. He successfully forced Rick out of the family home in Season 3 by making Beth choose, and she chose him. He has occasionally, in moments of genuine stress, demonstrated a kind of stubborn, practical survival ability that has nothing to do with genius and everything to do with not giving up. The show is interested in Jerry not as a joke, but as a portrait of what it means to be a person without extraordinary abilities living in a world that prizes them. Beth, who operates as a horse surgeon rather than a human surgeon because she got pregnant in high school and adjusted her ambitions accordingly, carries a particular kind of sadness that the show handles with surprising delicacy. She is brilliant. The show makes this clear through her dialogue and her reasoning. And she knows she's brilliant, and she knows that the world she's actually living in doesn't use that brilliance the way she wishes it would. Her relationship with Rick is a continuous negotiation between two people who love each other but whose love is also a trap. She enables him because she needs him to stay. He lets himself be enabled because she is the closest thing he has to his dead daughter. Part 17. The Philosophy of the Show. What Rick and Morty is actually arguing. Let's end somewhere reflective. Let's talk about what the show is actually saying, underneath all the portals and the comedy and the absurdism, what it's trying to communicate to the people who watch it, week after week, through season after season. Rick and Morty is, at its core, a show about the tension between nihilism and meaning. Rick believes, or performs the belief, that nothing matters, that existence is pointless, that caring about things is a weakness that makes you vulnerable. He has equipped himself with an entire arsenal of philosophical arguments for this position, and he deploys them constantly. The universe is vast and indifferent. Life is a chemical accident. Love is just hormones. Nothing you do will outlast the heat death of the universe, so why bother? But the show's argument against this is not made through counter-arguments. It's made through the simple fact that Rick keeps coming back. He keeps showing up for Morty. He saves people he claims not to care about. He forms relationships and then protects them when they're threatened. While he made a portal gun at least partly to give himself the ability to run from everything, but he keeps running back. Every time Rick acts in a way that contradicts his stated philosophy, the show is quietly making its case that the philosophy is the performance and the love is what's real. The show uses the multiverse not just as a plot device, but as a way to talk about the irreducible weight of your specific life. There are infinite versions of you in the show's universe. Every version of every choice is happening somewhere. And yet, the show insists your version matters. Your relationships in this specific reality are real, even if identical relationships exist elsewhere. The fact that infinite copies of you are having their own experiences does not erase the meaning of yours. This is the argument that Morty makes most directly at the famous speech in the Season 1 episode. "60 minutes. Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's gonna die. Come watch TV," is usually quoted as pure nihilism, and it functions that way in the moment. But taken in context, it's Morty arguing for being where you are, for staying with the life you have, even the life you didn't choose, even the life that is messier and smaller than the infinite alternatives. The speech is about presence, about staying. Rick and Morty is also a show about what it costs to be brilliant. The show is unsparing about what Rick's intelligence does to everyone around him. Morty is traumatized. Beth is unfulfilled and dependent. The family's stability has been chronically disrupted by proximity to Rick's genius. Thus, the show does not romanticize his genius the way other science fiction stories sometimes romanticize their brilliant outsiders. It shows you the full accounting. The genius saved Liz. The genius also destroyed relationships, enabled avoidance, gave a person the tools to run from everything that required ordinary human courage to face. And the show is about family. Not the idealized version of family, not the family that gets things right and speaks openly and resolves conflicts cleanly, but the family that persists through dysfunction, because something in each member keeps pulling them back to the others. Jerry should have left. Beth should have drawn clearer boundaries. Rick should have been honest. None of them do the healthy thing. And yet, the Smith household, as broken as it is, as often as it nearly falls apart, keeps finding its way back to some version of itself. There is something in that persistence that the show clearly believes in, even if it would never admit it directly. Rick and Morty is a show about people who are hurt and brilliant and broken and trying, in their different ways, to make something that holds together. The multiverse is the backdrop for this. The science fiction is the language of it. But what it's actually about is familiar to anyone who has ever loved someone difficult, or been someone difficult, or both at the same time. Part 15. Coming to rest. Final facts, loose threads, and the feeling of having spent time here. There are a few more facts worth settling into as we come toward the end of this journey. The show's first season writing staff was extraordinarily small for what the show eventually became. Roiland, Harmon, Tom Kaufman, Ryan Ridley, Wade Randolph, Eric Acosta, and Mike McMahon. 7 people building a universe that would eventually employ hundreds. The tight initial group meant that the show's early voice was very consistent, very unified, with a shared sensibility that could only come from a small group of people who were making decisions quickly and trusting each other's instincts. The show holds a 90% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes across its entire run, which is an unusual number for a series with more than 100 episodes. Most long-running shows see their ratings drift and fluctuate as creative teams change and audiences' relationships to the characters evolve. Rick and Morty has maintained something closer to consistent quality than almost any other animated show of its generation. which is particularly remarkable given the behind-the-scenes turbulence of its latter seasons. The companion mobile game, Pocket Mortis, reached over 14 million downloads. Rick and Morty, Virtual Reality, a virtual reality game released in April 2017, was the most downloaded VR game on the Steam platform at launch. The Rickmobile, a custom pop-up shop vehicle that toured the country, was visited by more than 60,000 fans during its run. The show's comic book series, published by Oni Press, landed on the New York Times bestseller list. These are not the numbers of a cult show that has found its people. They are the numbers of something that became genuinely mainstream while retaining its identity as something unusual. The Pocket Mortis game was scored with additional original music that expanded the show's musical world in interesting directions. The game's Pokemon-style mechanics, collecting different versions of Morty from across dimensions and using them in battles, became a kind of affectionate parody of collecting culture, which found an appreciative audience among the show's fans who were also gamers. The show's second season episode Autoerotic Assimilation, which features Rick's relationship with the hive mind Unity and ends with Rick sitting alone in his garage, preparing what appears to be a suicide attempt before being interrupted, remains one of the most quietly devastating things the show has ever done. The scene has almost no dialogue. The music holds. Rick sits with himself, and then he passes out drunk, and the credits roll. Now, the show doesn't comment on what almost happened. It just shows you and lets you sit with it. This is part of what makes Rick and Morty unusual. Most shows that want to say something about mental health do so explicitly, with dialogue and confrontations and intervention. Rick and Morty says it through implication and silence, trusting the audience to understand what they're seeing without being told. The isolation Rick lives in, the drinking, the way his intelligence has become both his only way of functioning and the primary barrier between him and anything that might help him, these are not explained or analyzed. They're just shown. And somewhere in all of this, somewhere in the quantum mechanics and the Back to the Future parody and the McDonald's sauce and the April Fool's premiere and the two guys on the floor of an empty office writing for 6 hours. Somewhere in all of it is something genuinely tender. A show made by people who love science fiction and who care about the uncomfortable reality that the most brilliant person in any room is not necessarily the most free, and who believed that a cartoon about a drunk genius and his nervous grandson could carry that weight and make you feel something true. You've been here for 2 hours. The universe is large and cold and full of portals to places more interesting than here. But here is where you are, and here is fine. Come back whenever you need to. Like and subscribe if this helped you find some rest. New videos every week, right here on Q Pickle Rick. Good night.